going to introduce myself. My name is Paula Valdelvira. I am one of the young delegates from Spain, and I have the pleasure of moderating this panel, which is made up of people who have a lot to say about human rights and climate action by corporations and business from very different perspectives. To give a brief introduction, today we are here with Samuel Martin Sosa, with a longer career at CAN, Climate Action Network. He's currently head of network development, and he's also has a PhD in biology, and he's an expert in climate change and environment. Thank you for being here. Also, we have Pauline over there, the last one, Global Climate Coordination at Proforest. That is a non-profit group with a global action. She also has a master's degree in environmental engineering and has completed multiple placements at the UN Office for Sustainable Development and at the Ecological Research Institute, and she has extensive experience in the international area. Thank you for being here. And also we have Hayley. She's head of Just Transition at the Institute for Human Rights and Business, documenting transition models from communities and industries around the world. She also has a background in politics as an advisor in the Scottish Parliament and many other relevant positions that if we are still talking, we can stay here longer and longer. So thank you all for coming. Maybe we have another panelist that is coming later, but we are still don't know. You know, this is the COP, this is how it's working. So we are going to discuss today a topic that is at most important today, especially in each of the COP's progress, and where companies and corporations are presented as key players in achieving a sustainable and just future. Their role in climate action is very important, and consequently in respecting the human rights that are linked to this climate action. Taking all of this into account, I would like to start by asking Hayley a more general question, but one of the that still reflects a reality in the making, which is what would you define as the main points of connection between human rights and climate action, and consequently, how do companies influence this relationship? What is the role?
Can you hear me? Is that working? Thank you so much, Paula, for the question. And really, just thank you to the Spanish delegation for hosting this conversation and topic at this COP. It's such an important one and so integral, as I'll try to outline, and really look forward to hearing from the other panelists. But to answer your question around the connection between climate and human rights, I often like to refer to the great Mary Robinson, one of the climate advocates of this century, who refers to climate change as one of the greatest human rights challenges of the 21st century. And that's really because climate change and climate impacts and human rights are completely inseparable. So in many ways, the answer to your question is sort of everything. The connections are everywhere. And, this is the first COP that has ever had a science pavilion, if you can believe that. That was opened yesterday, historically. And so we can really look to climate science to affirm those interconnections. We have these 9 planetary boundaries, these interconnected systems spanning land, water, air, ozone, and everything in between. And if one falls, the rest of those dominoes really topple. And we need all of those to sustain life on this planet. And, so when I think about that from a company perspective, companies can touch these different systems in a myriad of ways. If you're affecting land-based systems, you're potentially touching on the right to a livelihood. If you're affecting air quality, for example, you're touching on the right to health. If you're affecting oceans, you're potentially involved in impacts around work, for example, the right to work. So those environmental and social systems are completely intertwined. And that, in many ways, is why this concept of just transitions has gained so much attention over the last couple of years. It's, in many ways, a framework for really understanding these twin and combined socioeconomic and environmental implications for a sustainable transition. And that really then touches business, industry, and society as a whole. And why that matters, especially at this COP, this implementation COP, is because it's really now turning to the real economy when it comes to implementation. And that's where business plays a central role. Business is the driver of that real economy. And so I can say a little bit more about the challenges for business in understanding how to operationalize any of that, but I'm happy to pause there if you want to follow up or bring in anyone else.
Okay, I think you can tell us a little bit more because now we are missing someone, so we have more time to speak. Feel free to be able to speak if you want now or maybe later as you want.
I mean, I think the second question you kind of prepared me for was really understanding what is the role then companies should play on just transitions. What are the expectations of companies on this topic? And often I think business can really struggle with kind of where to start, how to get their heads around. And that's because there's not a single official definition of just transitions as a starting point. There's no universal performance standard that really says exactly what companies need to do, no exact KPIs yet that give them, you know, clarity. So that vagueness within the policy environment right now, frankly, can make business rather uncomfortable. But I'm one of those people that actually thinks that's a good thing in one sense, because it's very hard to put just transitions in a box. And that's because just transitions are really deeply relational. For them to really be successful as a transition project that's bringing in people at the center, it's really about understanding partnerships and context. And so as a business, that means really looking at where do you need to decarbonize within your value chains and operations, and within that, who might be affected by those shifts. Really mapping out that connection between where you're changing your systems and who might be affected. But there's real clarity that comes from the human rights framework, from looking through that people lens. And that's because we have an existing standard that offers a huge amount, sort of a toolbox that companies can draw on. So unlike just transitions, which is a relatively new concept that's been gaining traction, business and human rights as a concept has been around for the last 20 years, meaning we have a really deep evidence base of learning and application to bring into this climate context. And that means human rights due diligence can really offer a ready-made governance system for businesses to activate in the climate context, to really map their risks, to engage their stakeholders on how they're responding to them, and then to measure those results. And that, in turn, offers business real clarity and ultimately defensibility on what they're doing on the just transition. So we really see this as something that offers a huge amount of accountability to the conversation when business actually takes this approach, because without it, that justice language can otherwise risk looking tokenistic and really creating a different kind of risk for enterprises. And we are seeing that in some of the work we're undertaking right now. We have a project called The Costs of Green Conflict, which is really trying to measure and quantify the costs to business when they essentially get some of this wrong, when they ignore their social risks, when they don't undertake the kind of engagement mapping and measurement that we're talking about. And so we're looking at the renewables industry rollout, something that needs to happen with great speed and scale. We need a significant increase in renewables infrastructure around the world to meet our climate imperatives, but that can't be done without understanding the social implications. And just to give you one real proof point of how material this is for companies, through our engagement and interview process, one interviewee shared that over a 10-year period, they measured 200 million in losses and 3 gigawatts in undeveloped electricity capacity due to their lack of deep social risk management. So in many ways, that really demonstrates that rights failure equates to a material risk, right? And so you can also flip that on its head and proffer that early and meaningful engagement with those affected through this kind of diligence process also creates really positive value for a company. And investors are really starting to look for this within the system, really looking for socially credible transition plans, not pure transition plans without the people component. And without that, we're actually really seeing that cutting emissions but leaving people behind is creating a transition risk that is scaring investors, creating flight, creating different investment decisions. So I suppose I'll close there by just really saying that we're seeing rights, based approaches and embedding human rights within transition plans as a key means of building not only social license, but confidence in your business, and a business that's really set up for the long term. And so just emphasizing that this is not CSR, it's not ad hoc or optional or a nice add-on. It's really how climate action will actually work in the real economy.
Okay, thank you so much. I think it's so important what you said, and the form and the roles of just transition in this COP and in general for the business, because we want some concrete actions in just transition in this COP, and I hope we have them because they are key for human rights. That is basically the main point that we are going to share now with Samuel, because Samuel has like another perspective, right? Can you hear me well? Okay. Samuel has another perspective, and you can see all the litigations that are concrete actions having against business, right? And the arguments are human rights. And we want to know what are your biggest experience with that from Cannes, and particularly the human rights argument used in this climate lawsuit against companies, which are the main ones used, and also if you can tell us any particular or relevant case that you see as precedent of this trend.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. First, thanks for the invitation. And maybe as a caveat, I need to say that I'm not a legal expert. I'm here in the capacity of representing a network of more than 200 organizations across Europe, many of which are involved in some of these litigation cases that you mentioned. And maybe, before diving into the human rights element, I think very top line assessment of where the climate litigation is standing up to date. I think we are entering in a new phase for climate litigation, in a much more complex phase, I would say. And climate litigation is really on the rise at this point. Last year it was more than 225 new cases filed. And I think there's an element playing in this situation is that there are lots of political shifts going around. So we're in the middle of climate denialism. We are in the middle of a pushback in terms of climate progressive policies. Also, despite being, and we're in COP here, and we know, we listen about NDCs and climate commitments. Despite these commitments, then the implementation doesn't happen, and then litigation is there also to enforce or force a bit this implementation. And also there's a shrinking of civic space, which is very important. And all this is pushing NGOs, but not only NGOs, into the litigation area. So there's a new phase starting for this litigation. That's the first point I wanted to make. Second point I want to make is that the developments in international law are reinforcing these climate obligations with a focus on human rights. And this year we saw very important advisory opinions. On the one hand, we saw the Inter-American Court of Justice advisory opinion, and we also recently listened to the International Court of Justice advisory opinion. Also in May this year, a group of African organizations filed a climate-related petition to the African Court of Human Rights and People's Rights, seeking guidance of what would be the African states' obligations in terms of human rights in light of climate change. So I think this international law is reshaping the climate litigation landscape. That's the second point. Then thirdly, I think it's important to point out that climate litigation in the Global South particularly is in a dynamic of growth. And there are not only NGOs pursuing these cases, there are also some local governments and institutions playing into this field now. Then when it comes to climate litigation against companies, this is also on the growth. Last year, 20% of the new climate litigation cases were against companies. Of course, state litigation still takes the largest percentage, but I think corporate litigation is importantly growing. Another point I want to make is that apex courts, so those courts, the highest courts in the different judiciary systems, are playing a pivotal role in making these litigation cases forward. And there also particularly it's important to say that when it comes to corporate litigation, they usually have a higher successful rate compared to state cases in the apex, when they come to apex courts. And finally, maybe important to say that polluter pays principle is expanding, both in scope and also in the regional geographically. It's been in the last decade, it's been like 80 cases being filed. One case that I think has been an inflection point, very important to mention, because also one of our members, German Watch, was supporting this case, was this case of Saul Luciano Yuya, a farmer and mountain guide Peruvian person that sued the German coal company RWE on the understanding that their activities were, and their contribution to global warming was partially responsible for the melting of the glacier in the area where he lived and worked. And then, yes, it was confirmed by the court that companies in principle can be held legally liable for the harm caused by their contribution to climate change. So I think this was a very important ruling this year. Then when it comes to the human rights as an entry point, I think it's important to say, and I think, Haley already mentioned this very clearly, that the climate emergency is a profound human rights crisis. So we need to start from that assumption. I mean, the climate change is impacting human rights on all levels, political rights, labor rights, social rights, in all senses. And this is something that we in the NGO community have been pointing out very clearly for years, that there cannot be climate justice without human rights. And then, yeah, this is not only impacting the current generation human rights, but also the future generation human rights. And in that sense, the recent advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice has been very clear there as well. So this link between human rights and climate change, I think, has been very clearly established already by the United Nations, by different courts, saying that climate change affects the right to life, the right to private and family life, the right to access to food, right to access to water, the right to a healthy environment. So this is very well established, and in this sense, rights-based litigation is playing a key role in shaping and influencing national legal and political frameworks. So I think we are to see civil society keep using litigation to push for systemic both decarbonization and human rights improvement, and not only in high emission sectors. And we have here representatives from one of our members, Milieudefensie, friends of the Netherlands, and they just filed a case very recently, against a bank, ING. So it's not only emission sectors, like I said. So it's about all the across financial value chains. What's important, and we're going to be increasingly seeing these kind of cases. Like I said, the international courts are helping frame this issue of climate change as a human rights issue, and I think is especially important is what the Inter-American Court of Human Rights said. Hello? Yeah, said. It said that clearly companies have the obligation and responsibilities with respect to climate change and their impacts on human rights. So it was very blunt on addressing this obligation by companies. So what I think these litigation cases are leading to is to a move or shift from soft law to a hardening of this soft law in terms of due diligence standards. So that meaning that companies will have to conduct rigorous climate due diligence across all the operations and value chains to identify, prevent, mitigate, and also account for climate impacts. And this also applies to human rights. So, building on what Haley mentioned, this is also meaning obligations for companies in terms of strengthening the corporate human rights due diligence. Unfortunately, this is not what we're seeing at the government level in terms of measures. We recently saw in the European Union how there's an attempt to dilute the obligations of companies in terms of due diligence. So we saw a proposal of an omnibus trying to dilute the Climate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive and also the Climate Sustainability Reporting Directive this year. So yeah, governments are not paying attention to what the courts are saying, I would say. And you mentioned, you asked me to ask a specific case, and I think, again, coming back to Milieu Defensive, who is here present in the room, I think one noticeable case is the case of Milieu Defensive versus Shell, against Shell. So Milieu Defensive lodged a complaint against Shell, understanding that their business model and the emissions associated to it was causing dangerous climate change and then threatening Dutch citizens, and then Shell would be in the breach of the Dutch law obligation of duty of care of their activities. But what's important for this conversation is that these plaintiffs allege that Shell, by knowingly contributing to climate change, they were also violating fundamental rights that were recognized by the European Convention on Human Rights, namely the right to life and the right to family and private life. So I think this is, putting again the focus on human rights, and then the court agreed that this duty of care under the Dutch law also encompassed the human rights. So I think it's important, very important case. We're really thankful to our members that are pushing this litigation way forward. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, yeah, I think it's so important what you said, that we are coming from soft law and then going to more hard law. And I think also another key data that you said, that most of these cases are success against companies. And I think that also led companies to change their way of action, maybe for pressure, but also because some of them really want to contribute to this human rights and climate action, right? And that's where we are going to ask to Pauline, because she works also for Proforest. Sorry, she works for Proforest, and I really want her to tell us what are they doing there and what is her work, and also how this beginning of internal dynamics changing in companies, how you see that through your work in Proforest, how you see that they are going to a better, or at least taking action in this climate action and human rights, and also how this involvement arises also within the companies and how they introduce this reality into their actions, right? Because that's the main point, not also what they are saying, but also what they are doing. So, Pauline.
Great. Is this working? Yes? Perfect. So thank you so much, Paula, and thank you also to my fellow panelists. I'm going to steal some of your expressions because I think they link very well with what I had prepared, so thank you so much. I don't work at a company. I work at a non-profit, but I do always like to say that we have an NGO heart, but a corporate mindset, and for me that works very well. And I think it's also very much needed on a topic such as the one that we're talking about. So a bit about what we do. I think it's important for context, since you asked how do we hope to help companies implementing the integration of their people and climate goals. As a non-profit, we work with agricultural, food and ag companies on the implementation of their commitments across people, nature and climate. And I want to break that down for you a little bit in terms of how we go about that. Some of our focuses are human rights due diligence, deforestation and conversion-free commitments, regenerative agriculture, and we do this at the level of companies, but we also work a lot on collaboration and within multi-stakeholder initiatives in territories. Now the ultimate goal has changed from the vague people, nature and climate positive outcomes towards the word resilience, and I think that's something that you see coming up a lot at this COP. There's even a Peru Resilience Hub quite close to here, as well as the word just transition. If I'm not mistaken, Climate Action Network had as their main goal for this COP, it's the Just Transition COP for Climate Action Network. So I'm really glad that it's coming a bit more at the forefront. Now, what do we see in our work with companies? Not exactly that. We work a lot on nature, but specifically deforestation and conversion. But of what we've seen with some of our big clients is that the one that helps the most to build a business case to implement action, it is still climate. It is their climate commitments. Nature is growing through the deforestation conversion free, the EU deforestation regulation. But if we want to sell to companies to do something, it needs to count towards their climate target. And because of that, I, as Global Climate Coordinator, we have really tried to leverage their climate targets to also have positive outcomes for people and nature. And within that framing, we are working with Conservation International and the International Platform for Insetting on how to bring companies on that direction, in that direction towards higher integrity climate action. And what that looks like in practice that we are still looking at, it might be a scorecard for projects that shows, okay, great, it's an insetting project, it has carbon benefits, but how do we make sure that there is continuous improvement towards also people and nature outcomes? It might be just to start off a safeguarding approach for insetting projects, because that exists very well for offsetting, for carbon credits in the insetting space. So supply chain decarbonization, that is not very, very widespread. Now we're talking about people, and you said it very well. It's hard to measure and to make claims about people. It's always about reputational risk, litigation, and it's therefore quite difficult to have people-centered actions. But I have a few examples of what we do specifically with companies. We work really on the strategic level all the way down to implementation. So we have offices around the world. But I'll start with the strategy part. So we are doing some work with AIM Progress, which is a coalition of companies focused on human rights, where we're looking at what are the stages, and that's to your second question, what are the stages that companies move through? And the first thing we see is safeguards. It's the do no harm. But we also see some companies that are moving towards really thinking about physical climate risks in their human rights due diligence. Now, that's really, I would say, the minimum. It's still not looking at the benefits. It's not looking really at what a just transition could look like. But we're seeing just transition being used more and more for companies and their different teams. They have their people team, they have their climate team, they have their nature team. They're trying and starting to break those silos. Now, what that looks like in practice, I think in the food and ag sector, it's really early, but we see big actors such as the World Business Council for Sustainable Development also starting to work on, okay, what does that mean? And they're just published a business leader guide on just transition. And then, of course, the ideal goal is that people, nature, and climate is integrated within their policy, their governance, and their implementation. But how we are getting there, there's still there's still a lot of work to be done. Now, I want to give maybe 3 specific examples of what we've done with companies in terms of really implementation, linking all of these 3 together. First, we're working with sugarcane mills within our Human Rights Spotlight program, which is funded by Bonsucro, on human rights due diligence. So it's capacity building for sugarcane mills, and that is being funded by downstream companies. So a downstream company funds capacity building of sugarcane mills to implement human rights due diligence and making sure that the climate component is integrated. Secondly, we work on a smart mixed approach, which means that we look at the root causes of the issues, which oftentimes includes issues such as living income, climate impacts, and we look at the root causes and help solve those. That's the ultimate goal. For example, in one of the projects in India. And then lastly, in Mexico, we are on the ground working on regenerative agriculture. Could you put a microphone? Okay, sorry. Is this better? Thanks. In Mexico, we are working with companies to implement personal protection equipment, as well as regenerative agriculture. And even though those are not like, they shouldn't be seen as the tools towards a just transition, we do aim to integrate as much as possible the climate and the people lens within the same project. So in a climate project, we try to integrate the people lens. In a people project, we try to integrate the climate lens. And that's, of course, not the ideal case, but it's where we see where we need to start with companies. So I'll stop at that.
Okay, thank you, Pauline. Can you hear me? Okay, yes? Hello, this one there. Okay, thank you, Pauline. I think the work that you do at Proforest is so important. And we have seen with this, with the 3 of your works, we have seen different perspectives, right? But more of the context, to understand the context. But now I would love to ask you about a more proactive way what business can do to act And I want to start with you, Haley. From your experience, how we can encourage greater involvement by companies in this defense of human rights and climate action?
Thank you. For us, I think one of the main challenges company raise with us again and again on just transitions is they'll often say, we think we get it, we think we understand this concept, we think we might even be doing quite a bit of it, but do you have any examples? So I really appreciated all of yours, because we humans, and company practitioners especially, really learn best through observing their peers, understanding what their competitors are doing, and really learning from, proof points that are out there so that they can then adapt them to their own context. And so that is one key measure, key lever that we at the Institute for Human Rights and Business have really lent into to try and actually seek out examples of the best just transitions we can find. Because there's an awful lot of cautionary tales out there. Our friend just outlined the consequences of those cautionary tales at the extreme end of the spectrum in terms of litigation risk. But also, where are we seeing it done right that we want to see more of and that we want to see replicated across the board and made the new norm, everyday business. And so our project, and I have a few takeaways here for anyone interested, is called Just Stories. It's looking for transitions that are, underway enough in implementation, beyond just commitment phase, beyond the theoretical, actually implemented to the point that we can look at some of the evidence they've produced to really see why and how they are yielding results and successes. And from each of these first 4 stories that we've covered, spanning really diverse countries from Australia to India for our first 2 stories that I have here, and coming very soon looking at Spain, and later this year Brazil, as well as for very different sectors spanning coal closure in Australia, agriculture transformation through renewables in India, in Spain, and also agroforestry here in Brazil. We see some really interesting elements coming through as to what is making these such successful transitions that are really delivering large-scale results in terms of emissions reduction, but also in terms of improving the lives and livelihoods of those most impacted. And so I'll run through those 4 elements really quickly. They're firstly risk prevention, so a little bit back to the safeguards point we heard earlier that I'll unpack, but also the flip side of that, which is opportunity creation, the benefits that can be yielded from harnessing this transition, which is in many ways a once-in-a-generation opportunity to be grabbed with both hands if you're a forward-thinking business. And you can't really do either of those effectively without undertaking meaningful engagement with those most affected, because they're going to give you the intelligence as a business to understand your risks and to also identify those opportunities. And really wrapped around all of that, and if you do those 3, you're going to lead yourself to a pretty transformational outcome, or that's certainly the case we came across in each of these 4 stories. So just starting with each in terms of opportunity creation, and again, really pushing ourselves to think through that business lens and what's going to motivate business, and how do we find a way to really align that with the climate imperative and the inequality imperative. So it's really seeing from these stories that the most progressive businesses are seeing decarbonization as an opportunity to really redefine value and redefine markets themselves. And so they're actually innovating through transition processes. They're finding new growth opportunities through decarbonization, and in the process, because they're taking a people-centered approach, really building durable resilience within the communities that they're invested in. They're really linking their profitability to this twin imperative of the social and environmental. And they're making those interdependencies between those 2 elements competitive advantage. And the flip side, as I said, of that is also risk. Business is incredibly motivated by minimizing risk to the company. So if we can find a way to understand the incentives and disincentives to guiding company action in a way that aligns that with the people agenda, you have a winning formula. And in this case, we're really seeing that the old risk playbook is pretty outdated. And in many ways, Just Transitions is presenting this new tool in which you can, as a business, manage really effectively your environmental and your social risks at the same time. And in so doing, that's protecting your operations, that's securing your investments, and that's enabling long-term growth. So as I said, neither of those two are really possible without meaningful engagement. And each of our demonstration cases, each of these transitions that we've studied and unpacked in pretty significant detail, has found that they've been truly co-designed and co-created with those most affected. So this example here in Collie, Australia, where 2 out of their 5 coal-fired power plants have been closed already. The remaining 3 will close in the next 3 years, so they're well underway and it's happening fast. They designed their Just Transition framework with the workers affected, but also with the community more generally. And that's because in a small town like Collie, where 1/4 of the community is literally employed or affected by the coal industry, there's no other way of building a long-term future and moving beyond coal. You'll either create a shadow town that's left behind, or you'll create something different. And in Collie's case, that's exactly what they've done. And through the process, have attracted $600 million in investments from the state government and are generating a new green industrial hub because of the strength of the workforce of those coal workers in Collie that are now powering new green steel, new green magnesium, and new battery storage facilities that are creating a thriving long-term future and prospect for Collie. And it's worth keeping an eye on this story in particular over the next couple of months because some really exciting announcements are underway around kind of phase 2 plans for where this transition is heading next. So I share that example just to really emphasize the legitimacy that can come in a really material way from taking these approaches and the kind of durability that that creates. I mean, this is a 20, 30-year green economy plan that's taking shape in Collie precisely because they've implemented these principles. And that's really what I mean when I talk about transformational systems change. This, in this instance, is a town that was literally created by the coal industry. It's eponymous. Collie means coal. And so for generations, that has been the only identity that workers in the community have ever known. And that's a lot of grief and anger to process when the rug gets pulled out from under you. And there's 2 ways you can respond to that. You can lean in or you can hide. In this case, when they leaned in, they got past that grief, and channeled the community's vision for what life could look like beyond coal, and they found incredible opportunity and transformation in the process. So I think, just to really emphasize the power of examples, the power of these kinds of proof points to really inspire, I think, companies to learn from their peers, to understand how they can then try and replicate that in their own operational contexts and circumstances. And ultimately, I think we really need to see the system rewarding these kinds of cases. Collie is a very rare example of the kind of quantum of investment that we need to see across the board. 600 million is a pretty rare figure currently, and we need to see a lot more of that in these kinds of examples that are starting to emerge now. And we need to then multiply these proof points. We need to share the learnings, warts and all, because we're at a point now where we're not going to get everything right. We're feeling our way in the dark, and it needs to be okay to make mistakes, provided there's accountability attached, provided there's that continuous learning that comes along with seeking that end goal of a green economy, a net zero by 2050 that is truly people-centered. So I think that's really how we shift from commitments to momentum and ultimately to the mainstream.
Thank you so much. I think it's so important to share these inspiring stories, and also what you said, that we can make mistakes, but we have to take action, right? And taking action, Samuel, what can ask companies to avoid legal action, right? Because I'm sure you have a lot of examples and ideas to tell companies what not to do, right?
Yes, first of all, I would like to apologize because I'm really struggling to understand my colleagues, and I acknowledge that I'm becoming old. I hear worse than the rest.
Yeah,
That's
there
for
is-
sure.
there is
so
a lot of-
apologies if I cannot build on things that have been said. Yeah, what can business do to avoid litigation? I mean, I think I resist a bit the temptation to shift the focus to corporations. Also, based on what what I shared earlier in terms of the outcomes of the litigation cases and the advisory opinions by certain courts, I think the focus is on the states to regulate. So that's important not to forget about. So there's a role for decision makers to pass and enforce and strengthen polluter pays and due diligence laws, and with a right and a strong framework in place, and also with implementation mechanisms, there is a lot already done. So we will not have to look at what could business do. That's the first thing. But of course, yes, there are things that companies can do beyond that. I would mention 4 things. One thing is conducting credible, sound, and Paris-aligned or compatible transition plans, especially for those sectors that are very intensive in emissions. Secondly, they should abide by the highest environmental, climate, social, labor, and human rights standards, international standards that are put out there by sound organizations like the United Nations or the International Labor Organization. So they should abide by these standards. Third thing I think they should do is show some proactivity in terms of due diligence beyond the legal requirements. They can do that. There's nothing preventing them to do that. And I think fourthly, and more importantly, I think they should push back from watering down progressive climate policies and human rights protective policies. And I say this because, the evidence shows that there's high investment by companies and businesses to water down climate legislation and human rights legislation. It's been reportedly extensively by many organizations like Corporate Europe Observatory, for example. Now here we're in COP. We know that last year the EU governments brought along more than 100 fossil lobbyists to COP29, as was reported by the Kick Big Polluters Out campaign. And we know that several industrial lobby groups are pushing the EU institutions now in this new EU mandate to really deregulate many of the advancements that were achieved by the European Green Deal, including extending permits for free ride in pollution emissions, and also the due diligence laws, and as I said. And it's not only about policies, it's also about the trade deals, which are very important when we're looking at the due diligence. And B, abstaining from what I call counter-litigation. So we're seeing increasingly companies making use also of litigation to pursue climate voluntary commitments, new rules on climate-related financial disclosures, or even sustainability labels. So we've seen they're using litigation in this sense, and also, and more worryingly, coming from an NGO, is the use that companies are doing to try to shrink the civic space even more. So they're increasingly moving forward with what so-called SLAPs, strategic lawsuits against public participation. So these are lawsuits that they put forward against NGOs, trying to intimidate them and to silence them. And we saw recently this case against Greenpeace in the United States because of their actions against one pipeline some years back. So I think this is important thing we can ask companies to do. If we don't, and I think if companies don't take this seriously, what I see for the future is that there's going to be a spillover effect in terms of litigation, particularly as climate policy backlash increases and the shrinking of civic spaces that I mentioned. And there we will see developing of role models in terms of climate litigation, capacity building for litigators on how to litigate on climate and human rights, and we will see more and more cases of decarbonization plus human rights arguments being used and going hand in hand, and especially when it comes to corporate litigation. Also, I think if companies do not take this into account, I think there's a high risk for them for social delegitimization that they should take into account. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Thank you so much for these 4 concrete actions. And I want to end with Pauline, because you work with companies, right? You advise them. What good practices are easy to implement, right? Because they, as you tell us before, they are always saying, how do we start? I'm definitely sure there are easy ways to start. Which are these ones? And which ones are carried out by other companies that maybe want to make progress in the area?
Thank you, Paula. Is this better? I feel
Yeah,
like
I
it's
think
way
so,
better.
yeah.
Okay, it was the microphone, sorry. Before I answer to your question, I really wanted to react to some of the things that Haley said, and also what Samuel mentioned. So, first of all, sorry for all of the examples. I tend to prefer to explain concepts with examples of what we work on, because I really believe in the work we do. However, there is one piece where we should talk quite a bit about definitions, that is just transition. And the examples that you gave, for example, in the coal sector, I think it's clear which group we are focusing on. It's workers. In the food and ag sector, it's companies, if we talk about the just transition. So in Brazil, we recently had a discussion about just transition, financing the just transition in food and ag in Brazil. And we were talking about big, huge companies having to transition. So I think what we really should put at the forefront is, as you said, the populations that are most vulnerable. So it's smallholders, it's workers, and it's communities. And in the food and ag sector, even for company strategy, we see right now it's still their suppliers asking for money to transition, which is fair because we all need to work together to make this transition happen. But we should not lose sight of those that are most vulnerable. You also talked a lot about engagement, and we preach that a lot. It is so easy for a sustainability strategy to lead to switching supply chains. We see that in carbon. You look at your GHG inventory, you look at the ingredients, the regions, the suppliers that are mostly contributing to your emissions, and the first thing that companies do is excluding them. That's the first things that, as I call them, carbon calculators will suggest to companies instead of engaging them and really having the impact that we want. And to the policy subject, we cannot not talk about the EU deforestation regulation. We recently did a study on what is the impact on logistics and supply chains in Brazil for soy. Due to some technical details I won't get into, but what we saw is that some of the implications of the legislation make you not only exclude all of the smallholders in the south because you don't have the traceability, you don't have all of the data, but it also increases emissions. So it's super important to have this holistic approach. You cannot only look at nature, deforestation within regulation. You cannot not think about the smallholders that you are excluding. So I think that's really key. Now maybe the last thing I want to say is, and that's to what you said in your first intervention, is human rights as an entry point. I think it's so interesting because for me, climate is the entry point. But maybe in the geopolitical context that we have right now, where nature and climate are losing a bit of its momentum, here at this COP it doesn't seem that much, so let's leverage that vacuum. But maybe I should start thinking, how do we use human rights more as an entry point to inspire corporate action? So I'm really glad to be on this panel and to be able to share. So thank you.
I'm really glad you're using that mic. I understand it perfectly now.
Okay, thank you so much. I think it was very interesting, all of what you said, and definitely hope some of you have some questions. We have a little bit of time, so if we can answer shortly, but I don't know, is there any question? Someone want to add something? Maybe no. If not, it's okay too. I think they tell us everything that we want to know, right? So, okay.
I was saying I'm happy to, oh, never mind, I'll shut up. Questions are better.
Yeah, maybe. Do you want?
Thank you. I am Nina from Friends of the Earth, Netherlands. Can you hear me? So my question, I think, is mostly for you who are actually working with companies already. I am wondering, how do you think that, or do you think that companies will improve their their policies will respect human rights better if there are regulations, if they are regulated by governments. Right now we see actually deregulation happening, especially in EU, on the EU level, in the US as well. And I'm wondering, how do you think your work will improve, or the work of the companies will improve, if these regulations are more strict and governments will actually hold companies accountable for human rights issues?
Sure, I can go first really quickly. Thank you, great question. Yes, I very much think so. The two things I noted down, and they are not metrics and claims that are driving human rights action, it's reputational risk and compliance. Human rights, it's compliance. So regulation, really, really important. I would add to that responsible investment is also really, really important. We see companies in Brazil, for example, they say some of our sustainability KPIs, we only got to those because we got a good loan based on those sustainability KPIs. So that's also an area where I see human rights coming in. But regulation, certainly very important.
I mean, yeah, just to add, yes, please, regulation. Companies as well, the most committed at least, find regulation to be incredibly helpful and powerful because it creates clarity and it creates a predictable operating environment. And so the potential rollback through the omnibus of the CFDDD is creating uncertainty that those committed leaders are actively lobbying against, right? They're seeking a strong omnibus, not rollback on the original proposal. I think, though, it's important at times to really differentiate what we mean when we talk about business not being a homogenous group in any way, incredibly heterogeneous, and even to crudely divide it between that top 20% that is committed and moving regardless of the regulatory environment, welcoming more but not waiting for it. You have the bottom 20% that are, actively working against climate action or people-related issues, as often captured through the litigation developments that our colleague highlighted. But there's, a glut kind of in the middle, that 60% or so, that I think are completely movable. And in that sense, I see it as an opportunity not to wait for the regulation, to really find the ways in which we can create the case for why this makes such sense, why there is a market to be had within this. And that's not to crudify people, but it's really to find that path and way in which you can actually empower the smallholder through agriculture, for example. And I wanted to come back to that point you made about how each sector needs to be looked at in its own context. Agriculture is completely different from energy. And despite nearly, 10 years since the Just Transition Guidelines of 2015, it's still largely known as a just energy transition. So we're still really working on that visibility for so many other sectors. And just to make a quick plug for our fourth story coming out next month, I've been here for almost a fortnight traveling through the Para region of Brazil to study agroforestry solutions being brought by business, a company called Belterra that's really looking at how do we create a shareholder proposition for family farmers to actually own a piece of the value chain, using agroforestry both as a solution for their livelihoods, but also to reforest and combat deforestation while transitioning the food system itself. So there are really exciting examples and solutions out there if you look for them.
Okay, thank you, all of you. We don't have that much time. So in conclusion, I hope this panel helped all of you to understand better the link between human rights and climate action and the role of companies and business. Being able to listen to people who have worked that hard in this issue and who share their knowledge, I think is the key to enabling others to create change, right? Which begins with shared knowledge. So it is essential to understand the trends toward the use of human rights and the argument that is used in the cards to advance climate change, both for our present and our future. It is equally important to understand the role of companies and to encourage and pressure them, both internally and externally, to engage not only with climate action, but also with human rights. So once again, thank you all of you for coming here and for staying here in the Spanish Pavilion. Thank you so much.